All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on the Plan Bay Area 2050 Final Blueprint Outcomes and Growth Pattern and the Draft RHNA methodology. I'm Dave Vaughton, Assistant Director of Major Plans with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Bay Area Governments. And on behalf of the team, I wanted to say that we hope you had a wonderful holiday. Welcome back to 2021. Today's webinar, it will be nearly identical to our launch webinar on December 18th, which perhaps some of you are already off for the holidays at that point and are joining us for the first time. I'll note that that webinar was recorded and is available on the planbayarea.org website. So if you would like to check that out, there is a recording available. And today's content will be virtually identical to that event. We're excited to share these two major releases that are going to be considered by the joint MTC-ABAG Planning Committee this Friday, as well as the Regional Planning Committee for the RHNA item next week. I'm joined this morning by Lisa Zorn, Assistant Director of our modeling team, who's going to co-present the Plan Bay Area item with me today. And I'm also joined by Gillian Adams, the RHNA project manager, who's going to walk through how the Plan Bay Area 2050 final blueprint is integrated into the draft RHNA methodology. And last but not least, we have Ursula Vogler here with the public information team. She's going to be helping field your questions in the Q&A box. So we're going to start with a bit of housekeeping. The Q&A box is your friend here. You're going to use that to submit questions. Looking at the hour and a half we have before us, we're going to spend about 35 minutes running through a presentation on Plan Bay Area 2050's final blueprint outcomes. There'll then be 10 minutes for any sort of clarifying questions on Plan Bay Area 2050. Following that, Gillian will present the draft RHNA presentation for roughly 15 minutes, and then we have the whole last half hour to take any questions on the plan, RHNA, or any combination of those items. The material is all available on the respective websites, planbayarea.org for the plan and abag.ca.gov for RHNA. Our office hours program is ongoing, and we've already met with a number of jurisdictions and stakeholders, and so that opportunity continues to be available as we go through here in January. So let's get started with the presentation. So to kick things off, I just wanted to share a little bit of perspective about how this release fits into the longer process we've been engaged in. The release builds on 3 years worth of work on the Horizon Initiative and Plan Bay Area 2050, where we looked at 3 divergent futures to understand the impacts of external, economic, technological, environmental, and political forces on the region's future. And by generating new strategy ideas and stress testing them over a period of years, we were able to craft a Plan Bay Area 2050 final blueprint that's more resilient and more equitable than past long-range plans here in the Bay Area. And of course, because the strategies are more prepared for a post-COVID world that is highly uncertain because we've stress tested them against such a wide range of future conditions. As we move into the final year of this 4-year process, we're ready to start thinking about how to implement the bold ideas featured in this plan. Now, the final blueprint at its core was driven by years of public input with more than 290 meetings, more than 33,000 comments, more than 15,000 participants, all between the beginning of Horizon in spring 2018 and where we are today at the beginning of 2021. We used more diverse engagement tactics, both before and during the pandemic, put a greater emphasis on reaching out to communities of color and lower income communities, and targeted an audience as diverse as the Bay Area really is, talking to youth, unhoused populations, non-English speakers, and many other groups. This feedback helped us craft the final blueprint, which is comprised of 35 equitable and resilient strategies that align with the adopted Plan Bay Area 2050 vision to ensure that the Bay Area is affordable, connected, diverse, healthy, and vibrant for all by 2050. Ultimately, just like the puzzle pieces shown on screen, the final blueprint is a package where the strategies work together and achieve synergies. The 35 strategies cluster into 11 key themes, and these strategies were adopted by both MTC and ABAG this fall. This includes the revised strategy EN7, which reduces auto commute trips by requiring employers to fund incentives and disincentives to shift folks to telecommuting, walking, biking, and transit. On the left side, you'll see the 11 themes under which the 35 strategies nest within. For transportation, the final blueprint puts a heavy emphasis on maintaining and optimizing our existing system of roads and transit. It works to create healthy and safe streets by building protected bicycle facilities and reducing speed limits to make our roadways safer. And it includes more than $100 billion of expansion projects and optimization projects to create a next generation transit network for all modes. For housing, Plan Bay Area 2050 goes far beyond past iterations by including robust protection and preservation strategies for affordable housing, by working to spur much more housing production at all income levels, and by including strategies to create more inclusive communities. For the economy, the economic element of the plan includes strategies to improve economic mobility and address income inequality, as well as to shift the location of jobs to create a better balance within the region. And lastly, but certainly not least, in the environment element of the plan, there are new strategies to reduce risk from hazards, expand access to parks and open space, and of course, very importantly, reduce climate or GHG emissions. While many of you joining us today know these strategies quite well because they've been developed and vetted over more than a year-long process known as the blueprint, you can learn more by downloading the strategies handout at planbayarea.org. The strategies help to accommodate the forecasted regional growth over the next 3 decades, totaling 1.4 million new households and 1.4 million new jobs between 2015 and 2050. They focus growth in areas that help advance critical climate and equity goals, locally nominated priority development areas and priority production areas, as well as regionally identified transit-rich and high-resource areas. Transit-rich areas are places with frequent rail or bus service, and high-resource areas are places with the greatest opportunity for upward economic mobility with great schools, parks, and access to jobs. By focusing growth in these locations within existing urban growth boundaries, we can work to protect agricultural and natural lands from development while reducing risks from hazards. This growth pattern is essential for us to get to the greenhouse gas target, a statutory goal for Plan Bay Area 2050. Check out planbayarea.org to zoom into your community and see where the growth geographies focus future growth in your part of the Bay Area. To implement Plan Bay Area 2050, it's going to require a broad suite of federal, state, regional, and local monies. Totaling $1.4 trillion, new revenues will be especially important for housing, economic development, and environmental resilience, as shown on the slide. You'll see a much more detailed breakdown of strategy costs and how these investments have been structured to advance equity by strategically prioritizing projects and funding to benefit low-income communities within each strategy at planbayarea.org. With that high-level overview of the final blueprint complete, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lisa.
Thank you, Dave. So we know that the future of the world and the future of our region remain quite uncertain. And that's why the Horizon Initiative was so essential. It helped us to understand how strategies fared in a world with an economic boom, as well as an economic bust, and in a world with robust telecommuting, as well as one that returns to the status quo, et cetera. And there's some construction noise in the background because there's some housing being built right next door to me. So I apologize for that. Hopefully it's not too disruptive. So we're going to talk today about potential outcomes of the plan. And we want to recognize that it's the strategies that are the core of the plan, what we will work to implement in partnership with others. We've also had a chance to make strategic updates to the plan since the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic in March. Near-term revenue impacts, especially for public transit, were integrated in the transportation revenue forecasts. Plus, we doubled down on some of the most resilient, low-cost strategies like bike ped investments that can be more quickly and efficiently advanced in the near term. Sorry about those noises. We also had a chance to recalibrate the economic strategies from the draft blueprint with additional strategies explored during Horizon that are essential in times of weaker economic conditions. And we worked with the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, to adjust baseline telecommute projections. We then further accelerated telecommute adoption through flexible strategies to shift folks out of their cars. Lastly, we doubled down on the resilience focus of the draft blueprint with expanded strategies for other types of natural disasters, including wildfires, earthquakes, and more. Before we highlight potential outcomes associated with the strategies in the final blueprint, we wanted to provide a quick synopsis of how we analyze these outcomes. Our team uses three primary models: RHNA for economic impacts and regional growth, Bay Area Urban Sim 2.0 for land use impacts, and Travel Model 1.5 for transportation impacts. In the past year, we worked to gather the best quality baseline data for each model. For example, the BASIS team worked to gather parcel and zoning data to inform Bay Area Urban Sim. We then made assumptions about external forces in the future, and we vetted those with state regulators. We tried to represent each adopted strategy in the relevant model or models. And importantly, we iterated between the models to make sure that positive or negative feedback loops are captured. For example, a new transit project might induce more demand for housing near its stations. If you'd like to learn more, we encourage you to check out the introductory Urban Sim webinar on planbayarea.org. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Dave.
Analysis of the final blueprint strategies and growth geographies highlight that many of the positive outcomes of the draft blueprint remain. As shown on screen, the vast majority of new growth continues to be in walkable, transit-rich communities. The final blueprint enables a significant shift away from auto dependence for both commute and non-commute trips. It protects nearly all Bay Area homes from sea level rise through 2050. And ensures that all high-risk Bay Area homes are retrofitted to reduce seismic and wildfire risks while making sure that no urban growth is envisioned beyond today's growth boundaries. And the revenues in the plan are forecasted to support, not inhibit, future economic growth. Importantly, the final blueprint makes further headway on 5 key challenges in the draft that were the subject of extensive public engagement this summer: insufficient affordable housing, continued congestion and crowding on key corridors and systems, displacement risk, jobs housing imbalances, and importantly, the statutory requirement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The strategies led to an updated growth pattern compared to the draft blueprint, which, as you'll see today, helps to make progress on all the challenges I just laid out. But of course, one challenge is particularly central: reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As we all know, the draft blueprint didn't hit the greenhouse gas target established by the California Air Resources Board, whereas the land use pattern in the final blueprint helps us achieve the target by closing a chunk of that remaining gap and complementing the other strategies added by the Commission and the board this fall. So let's start with the household growth pattern, where you can see on the left the draft blueprint and on the right the final blueprint. Both accommodate 1.4 million new households, with the bubble size corresponding to the share of regional growth. There are some similarities. The largest share of housing growth continues to be in the South Bay, with a similar distribution amongst the big three cities, Bayside communities, inland communities, and unincorporated areas. The same share of growth occurs in the growth geographies. This continues to be a focused growth plan with similar levels in priority development areas and high resource areas at a level higher than Plan Bay Area 2040. But more of it in the final blueprint is in transit-rich places. We went from 70% of growth in these locations to 82% in the final, and that plays a key role in achieving the climate target. There's also more growth in the city of San Francisco and in portions of the East Bay, with less growth in Sonoma and Napa counties compared to the draft. Check out planbayarea.org to see even more detailed level on the county and sub-county levels, and stay tuned for our next item on RHNA, which will pivot to the city level housing data. So what drove these shifts in terms of the strategies and data? Well, each county and sub-county has its own unique story. But a central theme that runs throughout is getting towards the greenhouse gas target. Some particular strategies drove this change. For example, strategy H4 was modified this fall to focus a higher share of growth in transit-rich, high-resource places. This includes a good number of communities, a good number of neighborhoods in San Francisco, as well as higher resource East Bay communities, such as the region of La Miranda. Second, strategy H6, which focused on redeveloping malls and office parks, was revised, and strategy H8, which focused on development of public lands into affordable housing, was added to the blueprint this fall. And this meant that some of the larger sites, especially in northern Santa Clara County, portions of the East Bay, such as rail station parking lots, those are seeing more mixed use development with sizable amounts of affordable housing on them. And third, we just have better data for the final blueprint. We incorporated refinements to the basis land use inventory. We worked with local jurisdictions to review data and confirm more data for pipeline projects, land use, and zoning. And these impacts were greater in some counties and sub-counties than others. So let's pivot to jobs now. There's a similar story here insofar that there is somewhat less growth in the South Bay, with more growth in San Francisco, Alameda, and Solano counties. But at the end of the day, Silicon Valley remains the region's largest job center and the largest location for future growth. There's a bit less growth in the North Bay outside of Solano County, with even some job declines in Marin County as folks age out of the workforce and e-commerce continues to reduce retail sector unemployment. Turning to the stats in the bottom left corner of each of those maps, you'll see that there's significantly more job growth in the growth geographies, especially again in those transit-rich areas essential for our climate goals. And there's less growth in the high resource areas that in general have a greater number of job opportunities nearby. So what led to some of these shifts between the draft and final? Well, first, the replacement of fee-based strategies with an incentive-based approach to shift the location of jobs, known as strategy EC5, was successful at shifting a small to moderate share of jobs from the South Bay to the East Bay and North Bay. The focused housing near BART, as well as commuter rail stations, played a role as well. Sorry, let me say that again. The focus on jobs in housing-rich cities near BART and commuter rail stations played a role where you see some of this in terms of the Link 21 or new Transbay Rail Crossing project, where there's slightly more job growth near the Fairfield-Vacaville stations in Solano County due to that project and other strategies in that area. At the same time, you'll see in the sub-county data that there's been shifts within Santa Clara County, with some communities no longer facing the heavy fees to expand offices in job-rich locations like Palo Alto. Another key finding here was that strategy EC4 focused more job growth near transit by increasing allowable commercial densities in these locations. And this was, again, essential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to move us closer to the greenhouse gas target set by the state. So both the land use pattern for housing and the land use pattern for jobs play a role in achieving the climate target, as well as some of the other critical goals for Plan Bay Area 2050. I'm going to now turn it over to Lisa to run through some of the key outcomes of the final blueprint.
We're going to provide a high-level overview of the equity and performance outcomes of the final blueprint today. Refer to planbayarea.org for a 4-page briefer of all the forecasted outcomes and metrics. Let's start with some of the most critical metrics for our region: affordability, mode shift, and greenhouse gas emissions. On the left, you'll see a pie chart showing how a typical Bay Area household spent their income in 2015, with 33% on housing and 25% on transportation. The draft blueprint made considerable headway with new housing strategies and means-based fares and tolls for the transportation system. This is reflected by the improvements shown in the central pie chart. In the final blueprint, you can see the additional benefits provided by the robust expansion of the affordable housing production and preservation strategies and the reduced share of household income spent on housing. And you can also see the impacts of the parking strategy on transportation costs, which tick back up a few points, closer to 2015 conditions. In sum, though, housing plus transportation costs declined from 58% in 2015 to just 45% in 2050, with housing costs forecasted to be less than transportation costs for the first time in decades. There are greater gains for low-income households, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Let's pivot now to commute mode shares. How does the typical worker get to work? In 2015, nearly 3/4 of workers drove to work on a typical weekday, with the remainder taking transit, telecommuting, walking, or biking. The draft blueprint introduced the highest performing transit investments, as well as an expansive 7,000-mile protected bikeway network, significantly increasing transit and walk-bike mode shares. Telecommuting was also forecast to increase in popularity post-pandemic, even without public sector intervention. The final blueprint's employer-funded commute trip reduction programs, combined with additional bike ped investments, helped to further grow that modal shift. Nearly half the population opts to forego the automobile to get to work by 2050. We're excited to share some good news with all of you today. Thanks to the ambitious strategies adopted by the MTC and ABAG board, Plan Bay Area 2050 is now well positioned to achieve the state-mandated greenhouse gas target. This was certainly not a foregone conclusion. Due to the updated assumptions on future external forces, for example, the price of gas is growing more slowly than previously forecasted. Adopting Plan Bay Area 2040 again would have achieved just a handful of greenhouse gas reduction points, as shown on screen. The draft blueprint closed half the gap to the newly increased 19% per capita target for passenger vehicles by year 2035, but it wasn't enough to achieve this ambitious state-mandated target. But with the expanded suite of 35 strategies adopted this fall, we are now projecting that the final blueprint could achieve up to 22% per capita reductions towards the SB 375 target, with even greater real-world reductions if you count state and federal actions to further improve fleet efficiency. So this means that we are going into the consultation and review process with CARB with a plan that clearly meets the state target. Of course, the up to 22% language is intentional. CARB could require even more conservative assumptions on select strategy calculations that could move us backward. For example, due to the governor's executive order to ban non-electric vehicles in 2035, CARB has already started to float removing half of the greenhouse gas reductions associated with electric vehicle strategies. Since Plan Bay Area 2050 includes 4 points of reduction through strategies to fund electric charging and clean vehicle subsidies, this one action alone could lead us to backslide to a 20% per capita decrease, still achieving the target, but with a narrower margin. So it's important to move forward with a bit of slack to maximize the odds of approval in late 2021, early 2022. What strategies drove the improvements in greenhouse gas reduction between the draft and final blueprint? Well, first, as I mentioned, funding for the regional electric vehicle strategy was increased by a factor of 8x. So this strategy was designed to accelerate the Bay Area toward an electric future faster than the state as a whole and help to close a sizable chunk of the gap remaining. Second, the commute trip reduction programs at major employers, combined with parking policies and the travel demand management strategy, helped to shift more workers to telecommuting and other alternative modes. And third, existing strategies were refined to achieve greater greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The land use pattern, influenced by housing and economy strategies, is more focused near transit. Affordable housing strategies provide more options for lower income workers to live closer to work. And the all-lane highway tolling strategy has expanded to more freeway corridors to better manage demand and reduce traffic congestion and their associated emissions. Now that we've covered some of the key metrics, let's explore how the final blueprint outperforms the draft on all 5 guiding principles, and more importantly, how it moves us towards the adopted vision. For each principle, we defined 2 evaluation questions earlier in the Plan Bay Area 2050 process to understand if the plan was moving in the right direction. Starting with affordability, the final blueprint is certainly more affordable than draft. Bay Area residents would spend less on housing and transportation, just 45% compared to 58% in 2015. Reductions are even greater for low-income residents who spend a whopping 113% of income on housing and transportation in 2015, which declines to just 58% of income in 2050, thanks to robust affordable housing strategies and means-based discounts for transit and tolls. With regards to the second question, yes, the Bay Area would produce and preserve much more affordable housing if the final blueprint strategies are implemented. Through new regional and local revenue measures, the region could ensure that at least 1/4 of all Bay Area homes are deed restricted affordable by year 2050. Moving on to connectivity. Will Bay Area residents be able to access their destinations more easily? The short answer is yes, if you are using public transit. Statistics on the right-hand side show that the number of jobs accessible by transit would more than double between 2015 and 2050 due to compact land use development patterns and more than $100 billion to expand the region's bus and rail systems. Residents of communities of concern would continue to have even better access to regional job centers by transit than the average Bay Area resident. Next, will Bay Area residents have a transportation system that they can rely on? The answer here is a bit more complex. For motorists, it's a definite yes. Road pricing on key freeway corridors helps to manage traffic congestion and provide much more reliable travel times from point A to point B. For transit riders, select systems remain crowded in the year 2050, even with frequency increases on many systems and new rail and bus lines having been constructed. While not a major concern today, crowding remains something we need to keep an eye on in the medium to long term as riders return to the system in the years and decades ahead. Moving now to diversity. Question 1, will Bay Area communities be more inclusive? The answer is yes, but only to a limited degree. As shown in the statistics on the right side, the affordable housing strategies, as well as the strategy to provide mortgage assistance to low-income communities and communities of color to help them achieve the American dream of home ownership, do enable high-resource areas to become more diverse over time, going from 20% of residents having low incomes in 2015 to 24% in 2050. Fortunately, the RHNA methodology, which you'll hear about in a bit, accelerates growth in high-resource areas even more strongly to affirmatively further fair housing in the early years of the plan cycle. Question 2, will Bay Area residents be able to stay in place? The answer is it really depends on where they live. We integrated new strategies to reduce the risk of displacement in the final blueprint. Some are visible in statistics, like the share of the growth geography tracts at risk of displacement, as shown on the right side, due to robust new affordable housing development in growth geographies. Yet displacement risk remains stubbornly high in communities of concern. Our data indicates that many of these households are moving to other growth geographies, not being displaced to the region's periphery and beyond, but they still show up in the metric results. Furthermore, some of the short-term benefits from renter protection strategies are not able to be fully captured in our modeling work, and thus don't show up in the data points on the screen. Moving on to environmental and public health. Bay Area residents will be healthier and safer as a result of the final blueprint strategies. In addition to earlier points about resilience, climate, and natural lands protection, the final blueprint also invests in parks and open space with an emphasis on achieving more equitable outcomes. As shown in the right side, communities of concern have fewer parks today than wealthier, whiter communities. With strategic investments, we're able to close that gap by 2050 with the new parks and open space strategies. Furthermore, the environment of the Bay Area will be healthier and safer. New strategies in the final blueprint reduce emissions from non-transportation sectors while creating middle wage jobs in the process. As a quick sidebar, we'll be sharing a bit more with the ABAG board in January on the integration of resilience, which we've highlighted in previous blueprint presentations. We just wanted to remind everyone that both the draft and final blueprint include a suite of strategies to tackle wildfire risk, sea level rise, seismic and drought deficiencies, and more. To learn more specifically about our $19 billion vision to protect the Bay Area from sea level rise through year 2050, check out the briefer on planbayarea.org. Continuing to our final guiding principle, economic vibrancy. Will jobs and housing be more balanced in the final blueprint? Absolutely. A continued focus on South Bay and West Bay housing, especially affordable housing, combined with strategies to shift some jobs towards East Bay and North Bay rail stations has paid off. The combined West Bay and South Bay subregions stretching from San Francisco to Silicon Valley is the most job-rich area in the Bay Area today. With the final blueprint, we go from 1.8 jobs per home in that area to just 1.5 jobs per home. Furthermore, commute distances decline slightly thanks to the more balanced land use pattern. Final question is, will the Bay Area economy thrive? And we believe the answer remains yes. Despite all the challenges of 2020, the region is an innovation powerhouse with diverse communities and abundant natural and cultural amenities. New revenue measures in the years and decades ahead can help us reinvest in the region we call home and tackle some of its biggest challenges. And strategies to create new jobs and help folks start businesses can play a key role in jumpstarting job growth, specifically in critical priority production areas in the years ahead. That wraps up our walkthrough of the final blueprint outcomes and growth pattern. As we noted throughout, much more information is available on the project website. Local jurisdictions and other stakeholders are encouraged to sign up for office hours to get answers to specific Plan Bay Area 2050 and RHNA questions for their jurisdictions or on topics we didn't touch on today. And later this month, we will bring this final blueprint analysis to the Commission and to the ABAG Executive Board, as Dave already mentioned. Should it be approved, it would become the preferred alternative for the Plan Bay Area 2050 Environmental Impact Report, or EIR. And of course, this action will be considered in parallel with the draft RHNA methodology, which you'll hear about next. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dave to wrap up today's presentation.
Thanks, Lisa, and I appreciate you walking through all that great data in the slides today. The modeling team has worked really hard throughout 2020 to run both the draft and final blueprint and really think about the impacts for the year 2050. I'm going to close out today's item with a preview of the year ahead, which will be the final year of the Horizon and Plan Bay Area 2050 process. So there really are three remaining items to be taken care of for Plan Bay Area 2050 in this final phase: the implementation plan, which will take each of those long-range strategies, all 35 in the blueprint, and identify one or more actions that MTC ABAG will take to advance them over the next 5 years. Second, there's the plan document, which is the official glossy report that summarizes all the work done over the planning time period, as well as the technical supplemental reports. And then finally, that EIR, or environmental impact report, required by state law. For the implementation plan, we are doing a lot of work on that this winter. We're holding small group meetings to discuss the different implementation actions. There's actually a survey right now where if you want to give us feedback on which strategies to accelerate, we would love to hear your thoughts on that for the implementation plan. And we'll be speaking to our committees and working groups in February, including the Regional Advisory Working Group on the implementation plan. For the plan document, we continue to develop the document itself. And for the environmental impact report, we're finalizing the alternatives for analysis, as well as conducting the environmental analysis itself on the preferred alternative once identified and the reasonable range of alternatives. We can continue to have a strong commitment to robust public engagement in this final year, hopefully the final year of the pandemic as well. This winter, we'll be focusing on getting feedback on that implementation plan. As I mentioned, we have the online and text-based survey where you can help us prioritize strategies. That is available on planbayarea.org. You can check it out. Moving into the spring, we anticipate releasing the draft implementation plan, the draft plan document, and the draft EIR. There'll be a whole suite of public engagement and information efforts, from videos and podcasts and webinars in multiple languages to virtual public meetings and digital webinars with partners. We'll be doing postcards and flyers and a telephone comment line, as well as digital in-language promotion. And maybe the most fun part is the virtual scavenger hunt, where we will be encouraging youth and also people who are young at heart to get out there and check out the Bay Area and see how different communities will change over the coming decades. Should the Commission and Board advance the final blueprint as the preferred EIR alternative, it will enter in the environmental process that's already underway. The scoping was completed this fall, and we'll be studying it against the no project alternative, as well as likely 2 other alternatives currently under development based on those comments received in scoping. And remember, the focus of the EIR is really about environmental impact, seeing if there are any alternatives that achieve the plan's vision and objectives with fewer impacts on the environment specifically. So with that, we're going to pause for about 10 minutes for questions. Again, want to point you all to the website link where you can review all of the different documents released about the final blueprint. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ursula to see if we have some questions in the Q&A box to tackle here.
Why, yes, Dave, we do. I just want to note that we will be spending about 10 minutes answering questions. Any comments you may have will be read in the second Q&A portion after the RHNA presentation. And we do know that some of the links that we have provided are broken at this time, but we will fix them after the presentation. We will also be loading both of these presentations onto the Plan Bay Area website under meetings and events, so please look there. And finally, if you're on the phone, please use the raise hand feature. And after that, we read some of the questions in the Q&A box, I will call on you and unmute you, and then you can speak your question. So with that, we'll get started. First question, what policy tools are used to create inclusive communities?
That's a great question. So first of all, you can read more about each of the 35 strategies on planbayarea.org, but there are two core strategies under that theme. So first is providing targeted mortgage, rental, and small business assistance in what are known as communities of concern, low income and communities of color, helping to address that legacy of exclusion, predatory lending, help folks create businesses and achieve home ownership. And the second part of that strategy is about accelerating the reuse of public and community-owned land for mixed income housing and essential services. So working with public and nonprofit partners to redevelop those public lands into new communities that are much more inclusive going forward.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Next question. Growth projections appear to be primarily based on access to transit and economic opportunities. Can you speak to other assumptions that were considered? For example, local government's ability to provide other essential services such as water resources and wastewater collection and treatment services.
So that's a good question. We do start all of our modeling and analysis with local data on development capacity in different locations, but we also apply strategies that go above and beyond to incorporate additional development capacity in places that are, as you mentioned, focused near transit, focused near economic opportunity to address those critical climate and equity goals. So we also have explored some of the water issues you're talking about during the Horizon process, and we will be looking at the water impacts of the plan in the environmental impact report as well.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I want to note that some of the questions related to RHNA, I will save those for the second Q&A. We have not forgotten you. We're just going to hold those back. Next question. In light of the lack of growth in the Bay Area and increased outflow of residents to other states, have the population projections been revised to reflect this new potential reality?
So yes, we did update the regional growth forecast after COVID hit, and as we started getting some of the understandings of the impacts. And those impacts of COVID and the 2020 recession really are felt in the first decade of the plan. So if you look at the regional growth forecast before COVID hit and how it was modified after COVID hit, you'll see that the jobs projection was substantially modified. And accordingly, some of the housing and population projections for Plan Bay Area 2050 were updated in the first decade of the planning period.
Great, thank you, Dave. Next question, how many of those transit-rich areas are in the housing-rich areas?
So I think I may have answered this question already in the chat box, but I'll just to answer it verbally. You can see maps of the transit-rich and high resource areas and the overlap of them on planbayarea.org. So I encourage you to check that out.
Thank you, Dave. Very good. Appreciate that. Next question. Dave, can you expand on the slide point, no urban growth envisioned outside of present day growth boundaries? What growth boundaries are considered? Are the voter adopted urban growth boundaries utilized? Also, what qualifies as urban growth outside of those boundaries? So many questions, thanks.
Lots of fun questions there. So let's start with the first part there, which is the boundaries themselves. So unfortunately, the Bay Area doesn't have a uniform regional urban growth boundary in the same way, say, Portland, Oregon does. It's a mix of different growth boundaries, urban limit lines, urban service areas, all sorts of different things that have been approved on the city and sometimes on the county level. Some of those include voter approvals. So in the case of in the case of urban growth boundaries, what we were trying to do here is reflect holding the line on the boundaries that do exist in the region. So we know that urban growth boundaries have been expanded over time, and in some counties more so than others. And what the strategy in Plan Bay Area 2050 is really about holding the line on where they are today. So that may mean in some counties, development within cities. It also includes often some areas that are unincorporated that have been designated as part of the growth boundary as future areas for development. For example, in Contra Costa County, some areas at the edges of Antioch and Brentwood and Pittsburgh, for example, are within the county urban growth boundary, but might be right at the edge of the city itself. And then with regards to the comment on what is urban growth, outside of the urban growth boundaries, we reflect basically existing local land use policies. So the zoning that exists in those places today.
Great, thank you, Dave. Next question. Have the 2015 and 2050 outcomes in housing affordability and other outcomes been disaggregated by tenure, renter versus owner, and race?
So unfortunately, we aren't able to do all of the disaggregations that you're talking about, but if you do look at the outcomes document for Plan Bay Area 2050, you can see a disaggregation by income to understand how it differs between low income versus average household.
Great, thank you so much. Next question, are there means for incentivizing employers to support or promote telecommuting in the post-COVID environment?
Yes, so strategy EN7, the revised strategy approved by MTC in November and ABAG in December, would require employers to offer incentives or disincentives to move folks out of their cars. And telecommuting is a key piece of the puzzle there. You can see in our mode share charts that Lisa walked through that there's a significant increase in telecommuting compared to pre-COVID conditions, and that strategy plays a role in amping up the telecommuting levels across the region.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Another telecommuting question. Telecommute seems low in the projection for 2050. Could you explain how the evidence that a lot of workers were able to work remotely, given by the shelter-in-place order, was used to yield those projections?
So maybe I'll turn it over to Lisa to talk a little bit about how we developed the baseline telecommute projection, but also a little bit about the fact that not everyone in the Bay Area has a job where that's telecommuting eligible.
So we estimated a max telecommute rate based on the different industries of categories of employees, the firm size, and some research that other folks have done around what the telecommutability for those jobs really are. So we didn't use COVID or shelter in place data to do these calculations. We used more of an industry mix. Data on the industry mix and data on the telecommutability of these employees to forecast the max telecommute rates.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Next question. Will you be addressing how the Plan Bay Area 2050 addresses strategies of expanding access to parks and open space?
Sure. So you can read more about that particular strategy on the website. But basically, it includes billions of dollars of future funding to develop and modernize existing parks across the region. We know that the park situation in the Bay Area is inequitable. There are fewer parks, and the parks are often of lesser quality in lower income and communities of color. And that's an inequity that is essential for us to tackle going forward, especially as we are looking at significant new development across the region. We need to make sure that there's green space for everybody and that we're making sure it's more equitable. And so if you look at some of the metrics outputs from the final blueprint, you can see how that level of investment helps us close the gap of parks inequity in the Bay Area.
Great, thanks, Dave. Next question. What is the current average peak period, let's say PM commute time by mode for single occupancy vehicles in 2015 versus 2050?
So that's a good question. That is actually not one of our metrics, but we do have metrics that show travel times in the final blueprint versus 2015. Again, check out the metrics document for that. You can also see the share of jobs accessible within a 30-minute or 45-minute for car and transit, respectively, which are roughly the average travel time for a car and transit trip. So you can see the benefits in terms of access to jobs. And that's probably a metric that would be reflected in the EIR as well, some of the travel time data. So that would be something you can take a look at as we continue along this year.
Great, thank you, Dave. Next question. The definition always given for high resource area includes good schools. Actually, today, Dave said great schools, along with access to parks and jobs. There is no regional strategy proposed to increase school funding, although there is at least some mention of increased funding for parks, open space, and there's always been a placeholder for jobs. This gap feels like a missed opportunity to think boldly about long-term regional prosperity and economic mobility. Why not regional sales tax sharing or other measures to support public schools if good schools are defining characteristic of high resource areas?
So that is a terrific and very thoughtful comment. Plan Bay Area 2050, we've gone beyond our traditional transportation silo focus, really opened up things on the housing and economic and environmental front. I know that there are a lot of other elements that are often included in city general plans, which many folks have brought up, things like public safety or education are other key topics. We didn't go there for Plan Bay Area 2050 because this plan is trying to be more general and holistic than before, but we wanted to tackle some new topics in an achievable way. But perhaps education is something we should be thinking about more as we go into Plan Bay Area 2055. So certainly something we can take back and think more about.
Dave's already named the next plan. Very good. Okay, next question. How are you planning on integrating this work with other strategic plans at the county level? I'm thinking, for example, of the emergency preparedness plans, which may or may not exist yet in all counties. In general, what is your approach?
So that's a really good question. And I think something as we're working on the implementation plan now, where we can start thinking about how do we take these 30-year strategies for the year 2050 and connect them to actions that we can take between now and 2025. How do we operationalize the resilience strategies that are included in the plan? And so we've started to get some good feedback on that. We know that a lot of communities are going to have to update the safety elements of their general plans along with their housing elements, which is an opportunity for cities and counties to integrate some of these ideas and for us to be able to provide technical assistance in that vein. So hopefully whoever this commenter is will participate in the implementation plan phase of the process, which is ongoing, and we do expect to have a draft of that out in the spring.
Great, thank you, Dave. We're going to answer a few more questions before we turn it over to Gillian. So next question. The answers to the safe and healthy questions regarding open space and parks, are there metrics on transportation safety in terms of injury and fatal changes and on health due to air quality changes?
Yes, there are. Again, we have literally dozens of metrics in the outcomes handout on planbayarea.org. We didn't have time to go through every single one of those today, but you can see how the Vision Zero strategies move us in the right direction on roadway safety. They don't go far enough, and that's an indication that more education and enforcement and further very localized design improvements would be needed to get to that goal. And same thing for air quality. You can see a lot of the benefits of electrifying the transportation system in terms of air quality. So do refer to that document if you want to learn more about those specific topics.
Great, thanks, Dave. Next question. I have a question about EC5 policy, which changed from fees to incentives for moving jobs. Evidently, this caused the jobs projected in Palo Alto to go up. My question is, why did they make the housing projected in Palo Alto go down? Shouldn't more jobs in Palo Alto mean more housing in Palo Alto?
This is a very specific question to Palo Alto, so I'm going to generalize it a little bit to other sorts of cities that saw those extreme fees in the draft blueprint. So there are developable parcels in a number of these different cities that, let's say have the capacity to build 5 stories or 10 stories of development. And in the draft, basically, those fees were so high that those sort of mixed use opportunities were developing as fully residential. In fact, we were seeing some places where jobs were stagnant or even declining in some of the portions of subregions in the draft. And then the final blueprint, really what you see is there is a little bit more of a shift of jobs from the South Bay to the East Bay and Solano County as well. And you see those parcels in some of the job-rich cities in the South Bay developing more as a mix. So they do have substantial residential development, but they also have some job, some office and other sorts of job development going on as well. So, you know, when you have a certain amount of capacity and it can have a mixture of development, obviously, you know, that involves some different trade-offs between the amount of housing and job growth.
Okay, we're going to go have one more question and then we're going to turn it over to Gillian. Last question during this period. Can you please distinguish between transit-oriented development and major transit or intermodal stations? The environmental greenhouse gas limits require this distinction and would recognize the established research land use impacts on transportation by Littman in November 2008.
So, you know, I think that's a good comment as we think about some of the maps that we're creating for the final plan document to make sure we're you know, paying close attention to some of the stations where there are really large intermodal connections. Often those are places where there's the greatest opportunity for transit-oriented development to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions because you have such a variety of transit modes at your disposal. I'm just thinking about some of the hubs like Dearden Station in the South Bay, where you have light rail and BART and Caltrain all coming together. That presents big opportunities for transit-oriented development, both for housing and jobs. And we've really tried to double down on that in the final blueprint and the strategy revisions approved this fall. We're really focused on that. And that's why the land use component of the plan was able to push us over the finish line when it came to that greenhouse gas target. It played a substantial role in that.
Okay, thank you, Dave, and I'll turn it back to you.
All right, so I'm gonna move us along here to the second presentation of the morning. So we've talked a lot about Plan Bay Area 2050 and the long-term growth pattern at the regional scale, at that county scale, at the sub-county scale. That's where really Plan Bay Area 2050 is focused, is the big picture of where are we growing near transit? What portions of the region are we growing in? South Bay versus East Bay versus North Bay, et cetera. RHNA really is where the rubber meets the road, the regional housing need allocation. And this is where we zoom in a couple different scales, the temporal scale down to an 8-year housing need and a geographical scale down to that jurisdiction level where permitting and approvals happen. The Housing Methodology Committee earlier in 2020 integrated data from the draft blueprint, the Plan Bay Area 2050 total households data by jurisdiction as a baseline for the RHNA allocation. And the outputs at the jurisdiction level from both the draft and the final blueprint were included in the RHNA material posted on ABAG's website. But of course, Plan Bay Area 2050 data is really just one piece of the puzzle. That is a starting point upon which factors and weights shift around the allocations. And I know Gillian's going to talk about this more. So I'm going to turn it over to her to share how the final blueprint data was integrated into the draft RHNA methodology in December and what it means for jurisdictions across the region. Gillian?
Thanks, Dave. Good morning, everyone. I'm Gillian Adams. I'm the project manager for the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA process, and I'm going to be providing you with an update on the draft RHNA methodology. It looks like we've lost our slides. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. If you could go to the next slide, please. So as a reminder, RHNA is a state law that requires all local governments in California to plan to meet the housing needs of everyone in their community. In this process, the California Department of Housing and Community Development identifies the total number of housing units separated into 4 income categories that the Bay Area must plan for from 2023 to 2031. ABAG then works with local governments, stakeholders, and members of the public to develop a methodology or formula for assigning a share of the housing needs to each local government in the Bay Area. Each local government must then update the housing element of its general plan and its zoning to show how it plans to accommodate its RHNA. The RHNA allocation must meet 5 objectives that recognize the importance of comprehensively planning for housing in ways that also promote equity, strengthen the economy, improve connections between jobs and housing, and protect the environment. The last objective here, affirmatively further fair housing, is a new addition to this RHNA cycle, probably one of the most important recent changes to housing element law. Although RHNA has always been based on the principle that every community should do its fair share to provide homes for people at all income levels, the addition of this new objective makes this concept more explicit. According to HCD, the 2 basic principles of affirmatively furthering fair housing are overcoming patterns of segregation and fostering inclusive communities that provide access to opportunity for all people. This slide shows some of the key milestones in the RHNA process. The heart of ABAG's work on RHNA is our topic today, developing the methodology to allocate a portion of housing needs to each Bay Area community. At the end of my presentation, I'll provide more details about the near-term next steps for approving the methodology, but here I wanted to highlight that once the final methodology is approved, it will be used to develop a draft allocation for every jurisdiction in the spring of 2021. After a jurisdiction receives its draft allocation, ABAG will conduct an appeals process starting in summer of this year. And for this RHNA cycle, a local government or HCD can appeal any jurisdiction's allocation. After ABAG takes action on the appeals, it will issue final allocations by the end of 2021. Local jurisdictions will then update their housing elements by January of 2023. ABAG's formal role with RHNA ends with the final allocation. ABAG does not have a say in approval of local jurisdictions' housing elements, which is the responsibility of state HCD. This slide shows some of the key milestones for developing the proposed methodology. ABAG convened the Housing Methodology Committee, or HMC, from October of 2019 to September of 2020 to advise staff on the RHNA methodology. The HMC included local elected officials and staff representing every county, as well as regional stakeholders to facilitate sharing of diverse perspectives. The HMC worked collaboratively to recommend a proposed methodology that advances the 5 RHNA objectives identified in housing element law and is consistent with the forecasted development pattern from Plan Bay Area 2050 as required by law. At its final meeting on September 18th, the HMC voted to recommend option 8A, high opportunity areas emphasis and job proximity, as the proposed RHNA methodology. This methodology incorporates the Plan Bay Area 2050 blueprint and includes factors related to access to high opportunity areas and proximity to jobs. I'll provide an overview of the components of the methodology later in the presentation. The ABAG Regional Planning Committee voted to recommend the HMC's proposed methodology to the ABAG Executive Board, and the board voted to release it for public comment in October. This was followed by a public comment period on the proposed RHNA methodology from October 24th to November 27th. During the public comment period, ABAG received 106 written comments that provided perspectives from over 200 local government staff and elected officials, advocacy organizations, and members of the public, as some letters were signed by multiple entities. There were also 29 oral comments at the public hearing held on November 12th. The table on this slide shows the number of comments received from public agencies in each county and from advocacy organizations and members of the public. In total, 42 of ABAG's 109 jurisdictions provided comments on the methodology. This slide lists some of the common themes that emerged from the comments received about the proposed methodology. I'm going to briefly highlight what we heard, but I encourage you to look at Appendix 1 of the draft methodology release memo, which provides more detail about these themes and includes staff responses. Some of the changes to the RHNA methodology recommended in the comments include increasing the methodology's emphasis on transit and jobs to better align with Plan Bay Area 2050 and support greenhouse gas emissions reductions. More directly addressing hazard risk in the methodology or by using different data in the Plan Bay Area Blueprint. Including an equity adjustment that was proposed by HMC members during their deliberations. Reducing the allocations to some unincorporated areas, and incorporating impacts from COVID-19, such as increase in telecommuting. We heard concerns from a number of jurisdictions and residents about the ability to accommodate their illustrative RHNA allocation because the jurisdiction is built out or lacks sufficient infrastructure, while some jurisdictions highlight specific issues with the data used in the blueprint. We received several comments supporting the proposed RHNA methodology, particularly its emphasis for furthering regional equity. Lastly, there were also comments related to parts of the overall RHNA process that are outside ABAG's control, including concerns about how HCD calculated the Bay Area's regional housing needs determination, and a desire to delay the RHNA process because of the pandemic. So staff considered the public comments that we received, and we are not recommending adjustments to the RHNA methodology because a number of the comments we heard are addressed by updates to the final blueprint, while other suggested changes to the methodology conflict with the direction provided by the HMC, the RPC, and Executive Board over the past year. Thus, the components of the draft RHNA methodology remain the same as what was in the proposed methodology. But where the illustrative allocations from the proposed RHNA methodology used baseline allocation data from the draft blueprint, the draft RHNA methodology integrates future year 2050 households data from the final blueprint. The final blueprint growth pattern reflects the revised strategies and growth geographies that were approved by the ABAG Executive Board and MTC Commission in September of 2020. As noted in staff's responses to many of the comments received, incorporating Plan Bay Area in the RHNA methodology was always a key element in ensuring that the RHNA methodology supports the plan's strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and addressing risks from natural hazards. As Dave noted in his presentation, the strategies in the final blueprint shift the regional growth pattern with more household growth directed to transit-rich, high-resource places. Additionally, the final blueprint features updated baseline data gathered from local jurisdictions in the summer and fall of 2020 that respond to some of the comments we received and have helped to reduce the allocations to some unincorporated areas. Integrating the updated data about future year 2050 households from the final blueprint into the draft RHNA methodology results in changes to the illustrative allocations to local jurisdictions, which are shown in Appendix 3 of the release memo. And I want to emphasize that the allocation results for jurisdictions are only illustrative at this point. As I noted earlier, there are several more steps in the RHNA process, and local governments will receive their final allocations in late 2021. This graphic provides an overview of the draft RHNA methodology. At the top, you can see the regional housing needs determination of 441,000 units that the Bay Area received from HCD. In step 1, you can see that the very low and low income units have been grouped together, and the moderate and above moderate income units have been grouped together. Step 2 shows the allocation factors and weights. The draft RHNA methodology uses one group of factors and weights to allocate very low and low income units, while another set of factors and weights allocates the moderate and above moderate income units. The graphic shows the weight assigned to each factor and the resulting number of units allocated by each factor. The weight represents the factor's relative importance in the overall allocation, as the weight determines the share of the region's housing need that will be assigned by that particular factor. The three factors for allocating lower income units are 70% access to high opportunity areas, which allocates around 126,000 units, 15% job proximity auto, which allocates around 27,000 units, and 15% job proximity transit, which allocates another 27,000 units. The two factors used to allocate higher income units are 40% access to high opportunity areas, which allocates about 104,000 units, and 60% job proximity auto, which allocates around 156,000 units. The access to high opportunity areas factor is based on the jurisdictions with a higher percentage of households that are living in areas designated high resource or highest resource, on the opportunity map developed by the state. The state evaluated census tracts using an index of 21 different indicators related to economic, educational, and health outcomes. The job proximity factors identified the number of jobs that can be accessed from a jurisdiction by a 30-minute auto commute or a 45-minute transit commute. In total, the access to high opportunity areas factor allocates 52% of the region's RHNA, while factors related to job proximity allocate 48% of units. In step 3 of the methodology, you can see that the factors and weights are used to adjust a jurisdiction's baseline allocation. The baseline allocation assigns each jurisdiction a beginning share of the region's housing needs, and it's based on the jurisdiction's share of the region's total households in the year 2050 from the final blueprint. Using households in 2050 takes into consideration the number of households that are currently living in a jurisdiction, as well as the number of households expected to be added over the next several decades. Each jurisdiction's baseline allocation is adjusted based on how it scores on the different allocation factors relative to other jurisdictions in the region. If a jurisdiction has more access to opportunity or better job proximity relative to the rest of the region, its allocation is adjusted upward. Otherwise, its allocation is adjusted downward. The units the jurisdiction receives from the different income groups are added together to determine the jurisdiction's total RHNA allocation. This table shows how the RHNA units are distributed by county. The number in the first column represents the sum of the RHNA allocations for all of the jurisdictions in each county. In the next 3 columns, you can compare how the share of RHNA units for each county has changed from the last RHNA cycle, cycle 5, to the proposed methodology, to the draft methodology, shown in gray. You can also see how these compare to each county's share of existing households and existing jobs. Relative to the last RHNA cycle, San Francisco and jurisdictions in Marin and San Mateo counties would receive a larger share of the region's housing needs, with Contra Costa and Napa holding steady and all other counties seeing reductions. Compared to the proposed RHNA methodology, the draft RHNA methodology results in San Francisco seeing the largest increase in its share at 3% increase, with smaller 1% increases for Alameda and Contra Costa, and Santa Clara seeing the largest reduction in its share at 4%. When comparing the share of RHNA units from the draft methodology to the county's share of existing households, only San Francisco and jurisdictions in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties receive a larger share of the region's RHNA compared to their current share of the region's households. Lastly, when looking at jobs, Contra Costa, Santa Clara, and San Mateo counties have a share of RHNA units that is larger than their share of existing jobs. These maps show the potential growth rate that each jurisdiction would experience as a result of the total allocation from the draft methodology. These maps are also available as Appendix 2 in the draft methodology release memo. This growth is relative to the jurisdiction's number of households in 2020. The map on the left shows the results from the proposed methodology, and the map on the right shows the results from the draft methodology. Jurisdictions with the darkest brown experience the highest growth rates, while those in the light gray experience the lowest growth rates. In both iterations of the methodology, the jurisdictions with the highest growth rates are in the South Bay and along the peninsula, and those with the lowest rates are in Sonoma, Napa, and Solano counties, and the northern and eastern portions of Contra Costa County. The draft methodology results in a higher growth rate for San Francisco and portions of the East Bay, related to some of the revised strategies in the final blueprint that emphasized growth in transit-rich places. The fact that you see a lot of jurisdictions highlighted here speaks to the overall higher number, the housing needs number of 441,000 that the Bay Area must plan for, and the statutory requirement of RHNA that all communities throughout the region do their fair share toward meeting the region's housing needs. It's important to note that the region as a whole will grow by 16% as a result of the regional housing needs assigned for this RHNA cycle by HCD. Therefore, any jurisdiction that receives less than a 16% growth rate is being asked to take on less housing than the regional average. These maps show the potential total allocation of RHNA units to Bay Area jurisdictions for this RHNA cycle. Again, the map on the left shows the results from the proposed methodology, and the map on the right shows the results from the draft methodology. Jurisdictions with the darkest purple receive the largest total RHNA allocations, while those in light gray receive smaller allocations. The distribution of RHNA is fairly concentrated, with the 3 largest cities receiving by far the largest allocations, accounting for almost 40% of all RHNA units. The 25 jurisdictions with the highest RHNA allocations from the draft methodology would account for 73% of all RHNA units. Outside of the 3 largest cities, the largest RHNA allocations are mostly found in Silicon Valley, where there's both proximity to major employment centers and high access to opportunity. As noted previously, housing element law requires that the RHNA methodology meet the 5 statutory objectives of RHNA and that it be consistent with the forecasted development pattern from Plan Bay Area 2050. Working with the HMC, ABAG-MTC staff developed a set of performance metrics to evaluate how well a methodology does in meeting the RHNA objectives. Appendix 4 of the draft methodology release memo summarizes the approach we used and compares results for the proposed methodology and the draft methodology. Staff's evaluation of the draft RHNA methodology shows that it furthers all of the RHNA objectives. While the performance for many of the objectives is very similar to the results for the proposed methodology, there are some metrics where the performance of the draft methodology declines slightly, driven by the need for a more focused growth pattern in the final blueprint to achieve the statutory greenhouse gas target. ABAG-MTC staff also developed a framework for evaluating consistency between RHNA and Plan Bay Area 2050. RHNA and Plan Bay Area 2050 are determined to be consistent if the 8-year growth level from RHNA does not exceed the 35-year growth level at the county and sub-county geographies used in the plan. Staff evaluated the draft RHNA methodology using this approach and determined that RHNA and Plan Bay Area 2050 remain consistent. So regarding the next steps in the RHNA process, as mentioned earlier, local jurisdiction staff and partner organizations are invited to book office hours with MTC ABAG planners to discuss the final blueprint outcomes and the draft RHNA methodology updates in more detail. The winter office hour appointments are available until January 15th, and you can get more information about that on the Plan Bay Area or ABAG websites. Please note that these winter office hour appointments are limited to local jurisdiction staff and partner organizations. Individual members of the public are encouraged to submit questions or comments via email to rhna@bayareametro.gov. The ABAG Regional Planning Committee will consider the draft RHNA methodology and make a recommendation to the ABAG Executive Board at its meeting on January 14th. The ABAG Executive Board is slated to take action on the draft RHNA methodology at its meeting on January 21st. After a draft RHNA methodology is adopted, ABAG will submit it to HCD for review and will use the state agency's feedback to develop a final methodology and draft RHNA allocation later this spring. Release of the draft allocation will be followed by an appeals period starting in the summer, with the final RHNA allocation assigned to each of the Bay Area's local governments in late 2021. So thinking ahead to implementation of Plan Bay Area 2050 and RHNA, we wanted to highlight some grant opportunities that are currently available to local jurisdictions. There are over $12 million in grants available, including a new program through REAP to support implementation of housing elements. We also have a new round of funding for the PDA planning and technical assistance grants that many of you might be familiar with. Information about these grant opportunities is available on the ABAG website. This slide includes a few details about the PDA planning and technical assistance grants, and I encourage you to check out the website and participate in one of the webinars to get more information. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gillian. Okay, so we have a few minutes to answer your questions just briefly. And comments. We will try to get to as many as we can. I encourage you to send an email, and I will go over the email addresses when we're done with this. But if you did not get your question answered, we encourage you to ask your questions and provide your comments. I will provide those email addresses at the end. So we'll get started now. First question, can you explain why the household projections changed so dramatically between the draft and final blueprint as reflected in the updated RHNA? Why are adjacent cities with comparable attributes and transit access seeing such different changes?
I can start this one, and Gillian, if you want to chime in on this, please feel free. So I would disagree that the draft and final blueprint are dramatically different. I would say the fact that there's still a very sizable share of growth in the South Bay. The increases in terms of shares for Alameda and Contra Costa County were a couple points different. The changes are maybe more dramatic in a set of specific cities, but I believe more than 80% of cities didn't see a significant change in their RHNA. And when I say significant, I'm talking plus or minus 20% change. So there were a handful of cities that did see a large increase. There were also a handful of cities and jurisdictions that saw a large decrease, but more than 80% of folks were seeing something generally in a reasonable margin of change between the draft and final. So I think that's important to consider. Second is the fact that the strategies changed quite a bit. There were 25 strategies in the draft. There were 35 in the final. We had to get to a greenhouse gas target that was statutory. We had to tackle many of the other challenge areas that were identified this summer. So the strategies changed quite a bit between the draft and final. And in some cities, there were more data issues that needed to be fixed than others. In some parts of the region, there was really great review of the basis data in 2019 during the formal review period that we offered to all jurisdictions in the region. So folks that did a good job with their data review, and we were all on the same page about the data quality in those areas, well, there wasn't as much change to the baseline data between draft and final, whereas some other jurisdictions were a little late to the game. We tried to incorporate the feedback that we received about existing conditions data while also overlaying those regional strategies which affect the zoning and other attributes of those parcels. So I think that, obviously there's a unique story for every city and why the numbers went up or down, but those are some of the key themes.
Great, thank you, Dave. Next question, and there's a couple, so I'll mix them together about displacement. What is the share of displacement now versus in 2050? 40% of tracks at risk does not indicate the size of this issue. Is it extensive, 50% or more, or limited, 10% or less? And then the next question, can you say more about how displacement risk decreased so significantly between the draft and final? How did inclusivity increase overall if growth in the high resource areas went down and growth in the big 3 cities went up? It's a lot of questions, sorry.
That is a lot of questions. I'm going to try to tackle, I want to make sure we get to some of the RHNA questions, so I'm going to tackle this one relatively quickly. A couple things. First, the displacement risk metric was something developed in Plan Bay Area 2040. Very hard thing to measure. It reflects tracts that are seeing a loss of low-income households over time, so places where there's potential displacement occurring. We don't have a detailed understanding of the U-Haul moving from this tract to another, so we can't track where they're going to and going from, but we get a sense of the parts of the region that are losing low-income households over time. That's what that metric represents. You can see a breakdown of the displacement metrics. Again, in that outcome, performance and equity outcomes tables, you can see some of the different stratification of that to see more. But one of the key trends that we spotlighted was the fact that there was less displacement risk in some of the transit-rich areas, some of the key focused growth areas in the plan. And that's because the final blueprint produces much more affordable, much more housing overall. And with inclusionary policies, with investments in affordable housing production and preservation, we're able to ensure that there's a greater portfolio of lower income, and deed-restricted affordable housing in those places, which helps bring down that supply of affordable housing, helps to bring down the displacement risk in those locations. And I also just want to correct the record. I think the commenter was saying that there was a reduction of in high resource areas. The amount of growth in high resource areas was about the same between draft and final, but there are actually more low income folks living in those high resource areas in the final. Again, it comes back to that robust investment in affordable housing and focusing that in transit rich and high resource areas.
Okay, great. I will move to the next question. Going back to housing growth, how much did each of the 3 shifts, the 2 strategies and the data changes, affect the growth pattern? Some of these shifts are significant and have impacted the RHNA allocation numbers and the AFFH goals.
Well, first, those 3 things profiled on slide are not the only things going on. We got 35 strategies. You can, when the commission and board approved them, there was a description of the changes made to the strategy. So there are a lot of different forces at play here, but those are some of the key threads in that equation. On a jurisdiction level, the narrative is different in different places. In one city, if the basis data, if let's say they didn't review the basis data at all, and the data we got from the county assessor was very flawed, well, the data corrections might be the primary thing driving the change. Whereas in another jurisdiction, let's say a jurisdiction that lacked high quality transit, and then suddenly in the final blueprint a new rail line was constructed and again approved for inclusion in the plan. Well, that led to additional development capacity near those new rail stations, so that may be the primary storyline. These are the sorts of things that we are talking about in the office hours with individual jurisdictions, so they can understand what was the primary cause, what was some of the secondary causes, to try to disentangle some of this.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Next question. The state of California is prioritizing funding for high resource areas based in great part to school districts. This is in direct conflict with some transit planning locations. Is MTC planning to comment at the state level on this issue?
Gillian, do you want to take this question?
So I guess what I'm understanding is that the opportunity maps do focus on kind of some of those qualities of what we think of as a good neighborhood, including well-resourced schools. I'm not aware of kind of any sort of conflict with transit served locations, so I guess we would have to think about looking into that more closely and determining whether we're going to comment on that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gillian. Next question. Do we also have a sense of how this plan will hopefully reduce the number of people who are unhoused?
Yes, so the housing strategies include sufficient funding to provide housing to all of our unhoused populations going forward.
Great, thank you, Dave. Next question. The Planberry presentation shows that the final Planberry 2050 will increase the number of homes relative to jobs on the peninsula. However, when the Planberry 2050 total households is used as a RHNA baseline, the jobs-rich cities on the peninsula, such as Palo Alto, lose an enormous amount of their RHNA, which shifts into the East Bay and San Francisco. Can you explain why homes are shifting away from these job-rich areas and how this satisfies requirements to further fair housing? Why is allocated homes near BART given precedence over allocating homes near Caltrain, especially given plans to electrify Caltrain?
So this is a good question. First of all, I would note that Silicon Valley as a whole is seeing, again, largest share of housing growth, largest share of job growth. They're just a little bit smaller than in the draft blueprint. So that's some context there. There's more growth focused in San Francisco and the East Bay along the BART corridors that helped us achieve those greenhouse gas goals. The reality is that even with the Caltrain improvements planned, Caltrain will not be as frequent of a service as Muni, BART, some of our highest frequency corridors in the region. It will certainly be faster and more frequent, but it'll remain a commuter railroad, even with better frequencies, but still is more of a commuter railroad mode. And so, the strategies in the blueprint did enable some of that shifting, both the jobs and the housing, the matching of those, where there is a bit more jobs in the East Bay, there's also a bit more housing in the East Bay compared to the draft blueprint.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Next question. Why doesn't RHNA address loss of housing due to investors' buy and hold strategy or home buyers who underutilize the housing they purchase because they do not have active roles in the economy of this area?
I think that's a really good question. I think, RHNA itself is sort of a supply and demand question. And so I think one of the changes to the RHNA process in this cycle is the state trying to better account for some of the unmet housing needs. I think they do take some of the sort of vacancies into account, but I don't know that they have a good methodology for addressing, I think what the question is getting at, which is sort of maybe how housing units are being used. So at this point, that's to my knowledge is just not part of how the HCD addresses that.
Okay, given the hour, we'll take one more question. I want to encourage you to send any unanswered questions or comments to 2 websites. For Plan Bay Area, it's info@planbayarea.org. And for RHNA, it's RHNA@bayareametro.gov. I've put those email addresses in the chat. As well, the PowerPoints are now up on the our Plan Bay Area website. The link is also in the chat. Sorry for the confusion there, but it's the last link. And we will also post a recording and the presentation under this January 5th webinar. So this final question we will be asking is, can you do more to have all towns and cities take their fair share of housing? I'm thinking of my neighbor in Atherton. This town has recently permanently closed its Caltrain station as a strategy to reduce the RHNA allocation. This seems very unfair when one considers that their housekeepers, gardener, etc., live in denser housing areas nearby Redwood City or East Palo Alto and the Bellhaven area of Menlo Park.
So I think actually this is one of the ways in which this RHNA methodology actually addresses this person's concerns. So one of the ways in which the factors that we're including this time, we're including access to high opportunity areas, which again is referring to places that sort of offer economic upward mobility. And it also includes places that have access to jobs. So even though a place like Atherton may not have many jobs within its boundaries, it is located near places that have jobs nearby. And so that's one of the factors that's taken into account. And so that's what is allocating sort of higher RHNA numbers to some of those types of places compared to what they might have received in the past. And I think the primary goal of the factors that the HMC chose was to address some of those equity concerns.
Great, thank you so much, Gillian. I'll turn it back to Dave to close us out.
So thanks, everybody. We really appreciate you joining for today's second of our webinars. Again, the webinars are available. This webinar has been recorded and we posted in the next few days, but you can also see the recording of the first webinar. It's already available on the website. Again, thanks for your participation in this long-range planning work with MTC and ABAG. We look forward to your continued engagement here in 2021 as we move into the implementation phase of Plan Bay Area 2050, as well as the appeals phase of the RHNA process. So with that, thanks so much for attending and have a wonderful day.